Bonjour, hi, I'm Jean-Daniel, and I'm Acadian. In the 18th century, Acadian meant French-speaking Roman Catholic settlers and their descendants in what we now call Nova Scotia. There were about 15,000 of us in 1755. Depending how one counts Acadians, or rather who counts as an Acadian, there are between 500,000 and 2 million of us today. There's so much variation in numbers because some use the term for all descendants, no matter where we live today or what languages we speak or religion we practice. And some limit it to where one lives now or what language we speak now, not counting descendants who have spread afar or perhaps no longer speak French, but perhaps counting all francophones who live in certain regions. In other words, je sais pas. Acadians had lived in our homeland for over a century by 1755, most of them with no personal memory of or family living in France, when the British conquered the territory and began le grand dérangement, the great upheaval, expelling us from our homes, convinced French Catholics could never be trusted. 2/3 of Acadians left what is now Canada altogether, deported to France, a land most had never called home and had never been, or the Caribbean. But the largest contingent sent to the bayous of Louisiana. There you see us still formally called Acadians, but also often Cajuns, which comes from English speakers mishearing I'm Acadian as I'm Acadian. But Canadian Acadians and Louisiana Cajuns, we are one people, and our accents in French remain remarkably similar, more similar in most cases than our accents in English, I think. Half of those deported beyond Canada died during the decade of ongoing deportation from exposure, hunger, thirst, and disease. It was seldom outright intended murder, but through deportation, deprivation, and forced assimilation, the goal was to eliminate us. My own ancestors were among the third who fled to less settled and less economically prosperous parts of what are now the maritime provinces of Canada, where we still have majority French-speaking communities and schools and churches and universities in otherwise mostly English provinces, as well as a few thriving communities in Maine and neighboring Quebec, where I now live, and where we blend in a little bit more, but often fly our flag and confuse our neighbors with our very different flavor of Canadian French. The English won, in the sense that they took over the land and remain everywhere we remain. But we did not entirely lose, in that we exist. Economic realities took my Acadian ancestors from Nova Scotia to New Brunswick, to Quebec, to Massachusetts, where I was born, where in 1999 a teenage version of me found himself as a tour guide at a local historic house, the Isaac Winslow House in Marshfield. A later inhabitant of that home, Colonel John Winslow, was the British military officer responsible for the expulsion of my ancestors. And most of my tour groups were genealogy enthusiasts, proud of their ancestor. He was just following orders, perhaps, but as I saw it, I spent my Saturdays showing people Satan's old bedroom. And my goodness, they loved the wallpaper. Two pop culture moments made English speakers care about our story, a century apart. In 1847, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow took an old folk story, whose origins are complex and disputed, and turned it into an epic poem in English, Evangeline. The details are historic fiction, but the emotional truths resonated with a wide audience. Today, throughout the Canadian Maritimes and Louisiana, wherever you find French speakers, you find roads, restaurants, monuments named Evangeline. Longfellow wrote the poem from afar, not traveling to Nova Scotia or Louisiana. And in his version, he doesn't really ever mention that the British committing the atrocities are in fact mostly New Englanders. I attended church when I was in college next to Longfellow's house. Its street address was Longfellow Park. This at least was a little bit of a cleansing of my Acadian palate from my teenage years giving tours of Colonel Winslow's house. The second pop culture reminder to English speakers about us was the 1975 folk rock song Acadian Driftwood by the band. Now, I will sob every time I hear it. 10 out of 10, no notes. But that's an emotional, not historical review. My whole life, I've been proud of being Acadian. Proud of our people's refusal to disappear, our perseverance. I refused to be part of that disappearance, making sure I spent childhood summers in New Brunswick and Quebec and speaking French, despite having been born in Massachusetts, and ultimately making sure my own children would be raised back in Canada and in French, so that on my branch of the family tree at least, we would never lose those parts of our identity. The Acadian identity to me is a story of both persecution and perseverance. It is a victim narrative, but also a survival story. About 2 weeks ago, I was able to finally go to Louisiana for the first time in my life to seek out my cultural Cajun cousins. I didn't record then because I was sick and had no voice. But I hope I have shown my nerd credentials to demonstrate that I was intellectually prepared. But that's not the same as being emotionally ready for the visit. I saw and experienced so much of what I hoped and expected to see. Bilingual signs, historical preservation, both the Acadian flag I knew from home and its Cajun variant. In Eastern Canada, reliably an Acadian flag outside would mean somebody inside would speak to me in French. But I did struggle to find French speakers even in the most Cajun communities. It was very clear to me that my people had lived there, but it took a little digging to see that they still do. Louisianisation, turning into Louisiana, is sometimes a scare word in French Canadian politics. Before visiting, I felt like that was profoundly unfair to the resisting and persevering Cajun and Creole communities. My feelings now are more mixed, because I remain proudly in solidarity with people in Louisiana who maintain our language, and do so through arts and music and education. But I also knew that it wasn't a place where I could feel at home as a French speaker, where I could genuinely live in French. And perhaps, as a displaced Acadian in New England, I should have moved to Louisiana instead of Quebec for exactly that reason. I was so grateful for the French speakers I did meet, but they were harder to find than the census data led me to believe that they would be. One of the things that truly surprised me about Acadian identity in Louisiana, again, as experienced on a short visit, was that it was so celebrated by people who did not know French. I mentioned historically we were French Catholics, and I confess now, I'm not Catholic. In Acadian regions of Canada, Catholic churches are closing fast, even as French primary schools still grow. Northern Acadians, our identity is very rooted in the French language. But I saw a Cajun identity that was much more still Catholic. I had a wonderful conversation with the Roman Catholic priest at a parish surrounded by Acadian flags. And he told me in English that he was Acadian, born and raised in the parish he now served. And I admit I was a bit surprised he didn't know French at all and called himself Acadian. And he was friendly and asked me what I do for work and where I was from, and I said I'm an Acadian Protestant pastor. And it was his turn to be surprised at who was calling himself Acadian. We have no government or passports or agreed upon land, so there's no agreed upon gatekeeper of Acadian identity. Is an English speaker with a French name in Louisiana, or a Protestant pastor now living in Quebec, or a new immigrant to Nova Scotia from Senegal whose children go to the Acadian public schools. Are we Acadians? Or do we only count people who currently live in the Maritimes or Louisiana and currently speak French and are good Catholics? I prefer to count us all. Each one of us says that this story of 2.5 centuries of making us move and telling us to be English under British and American and Canadian and Spanish and Confederate rule hasn't made us go away. We've been expelled, but not all of us. Assimilated, but not all of us. I was emotionally overwhelmed at the Vermillionville Historic Village in Lafayette, Louisiana. It was 40 degrees Celsius, and I was keeping my dog on a short leash amongst alligator warning signs, so those were foreign experiences. But each house in the village was deeply familiar. Once I was indoors, once I stepped inside, there was no way to tell Lafayette, Louisiana apart from the Acadian historic village in Caraquet, New Brunswick. Each Cajun living room was like a portal between the Louisiana Bayou and an identical Acadian living room on a rocky, cold Canadian shore. I saw the poverty and suffering of my ancestors. I objectively know no Louisiana Cajun is my ancestor, but I felt so clearly they're my people. Now, privileged people love to deride other people's victim narratives, love to pretend that the other party is merely whining, lest anybody admit that perhaps they are an oppressor, or at least unjustly the beneficiary of oppressors. And the Acadian victim mentality is important to me because it's true. And without recognition of that truth, we don't appreciate the resilience of our own community. Without recognition of that truth, we don't recognize parallel abuses that continue to happen to our own community or to other ethnic, cultural, and religious minorities. Without that truth, we are less equipped to be aware of or in solidarity with those facing harm now. But there are two major complications to modern white Acadians, and not all Acadians are white, taking too much victimhood on ourselves. First of all, Acadians absolutely were white settlers on unceded native land. This is sometimes a faux woke point made by our English-speaking neighbors to justify their behavior, past and ongoing, wrapping their bigotry towards a minority in an insensitive, progressive sympathy for a smaller minority about whose rights they don't actually care. But this is absolutely a legitimate point when raised by First Nations peoples, including in ongoing fishing disputes in modern Eastern Canada. And any Acadian claims against our English oppressors based on "we were here first" are off by millennia because we are ignoring First Nations peoples. And another layer. A layer I factually had known, but had not emotionally confronted until I visited Louisiana. I visited a site called the Maison Olivier. It was an Acadian home with slave quarters. It was not the small bayou shack of a displaced victim. It was a slave plantation. And Acadians, my people, owned it. My people, my story of us marginalized but triumphant, was shattered, and rightly so. Given the opportunity to succeed in the American South, Acadians did, in horrific ways. American Northerners, and to an amplified degree, Canadians, distance our ancestors' complicity and participation in slavery by boasting about banning it earlier than the South, without sufficient reconciling with what that necessarily implies. The evil of slavery was a sin of our hometowns too. When I saw a list of Acadian refugees at one of the historic sites, my heart swelled with Acadian pride. Then I saw a list of slaves, written in French, and I wept. Slavery is abhorrent and evil, and I hope I would have wept too if I had seen it in English, with empathy for each life evilly co-opted for mere earthly wealth, represented on each line. But I have not explored the American South much before, nor visited other museums or historic sites, certainly no other plantation where people were enslaved. I worry that had I visited any other one first, maybe I would have given myself unmerited distance. Could have told myself that this evil was done by wealthy, white, English Americans. But my ancestors were poor victims. I worry I might have thought that. I could not indulge such a thought when I read the word esclave, slaves. I want the romantic heroine Evangeline to be my cousin, my family, not Monsieur Olivier, the enslaver. But Evangeline is a figment of a poet's imagination, and Monsieur Olivier and his house were built by crimes against humanity, and were real. I am an Acadian. My people have been colonizers and settlers. We have been displaced and deported. We have faced the depth of poverty, and we have been beneficiaries of the most evil profiteering in history. We must remember, but remember the whole story. We have fought to survive, and that fight to survive can make us empathize with others. We have been victims, and that can make us be in solidarity with victims. Or we can use it as an excuse for becoming oppressors. Victims and oppressors are not mutually exclusive categories. Neither are inherited or inevitable. They're made by choices. Choices people make to victimize and oppress one another. My people, outnumbered though we are, have refused to disappear. I'm proud of my ancestors for that. I'm proud of my Cajun cousins for that, for the Acadian communities in the Maritimes for that. But I will not defend anything that they did to First Nations or Africans because they were victims just trying to survive, any more than as a teenager I tolerated a tourist telling me that John Winslow was just following orders. Vive l'Acadie.